Yeah, you can. Can you hear me? Now? Now? What mic? Yeah. I'm going to use that one. Yeah, I'm sitting outside. Yeah, I'm speaking. So imagine I'm saying now, short biography of the Prophet ﷺ. Can you hear it? Good? Ah. Yeah, that's fine. Mustaq. Yes. How would you like me to reach? Is there any points you want? Where would you like me to stop?
So last week we left off at the Battle of Badr.
Oh, Battle of Badr? Yeah.
No.
We are in the short biography of the Prophet ﷺ, and we left off at the chapter of the Jews and the hypocrites. Bismillah. In the first year of his reign at Medina, the Prophet ﷺ made a solemn treaty with the Jewish tribes, which secured to them rights of citizenship and full religious liberty in return for their support of the new state.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. This is the second session, and the final session we're going to be covering the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So last lesson, the first part, we talked about, of course, the life of the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca. We talked about the da'wah, we talked about the early Muslims, we talked about the trials and tribulations that the Muslims faced. And now we're going to be talking about his time in Medina, And one thing we need to realize also is how, if we were to look at a book of Seerah, any book of Seerah, you would notice that the chapters and the information we have of the life of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina would be around 3 times more than the information we have about him in Mecca. There's a lot more information of his time in Medina as opposed to his time in Mecca. Even though he spent how many years in Mecca in total? 53 years. So he's in Mecca for 53 years. And only in Medina for 10 years. But we don't have that much information of his time in Mecca compared to his time in Medina. The question is, why? Why is this the case? Very good. The Muslims were restricted in terms of their worship. They were being persecuted in Mecca. They weren't allowed to, give da'wah, call people to Islam. They had to congregate, secretly, privately, to be able to learn the Quran, etc. Whereas in Medina, they were openly Muslim. They were able to teach Islam openly. Everybody was learning. Everybody was benefiting. People were teaching. So it was an open da'wah. People were learning openly. Islam was open. You were worshipping Allah freely. And so there was more widespread dissemination of Islam and the deen. And so you have many narrations of the companions doing certain things in terms of what they said or how they interacted with others, and what the Prophet said, etc., etc. Whereas in Mecca, of course, they're being persecuted. Nobody had time to narrate a hadith and talk about what was happening and what the Prophet was wearing, how he slept, etc., etc. No, people were being killed, they were being persecuted. So the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the first things he did when he came to Medina is he built the Prophet's masjid. And the first masjid in the lifetime of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wasn't actually the Prophet's masjid in Medina. It was Masjid Quba. And Masjid Quba was an area called Quba just outside of Medina. And he stopped there before he went into Medina. And Quba at the time was on the outskirts of Medina. It was like a separate area where some tribes lived. And so he built the masjid there, which is still there today, of course, the famous Masjid Quba. And then he went into Medina. He stayed there for 3 days. And then he went into Medina, and then he built the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also, one of the other things he did, as we mentioned here today, just now, is that he made a treaty with the Jewish tribes of Medina. Who were the Jewish tribes of Medina? There were 3 main tribes: Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa, and Banu Nadir. These are the 3 main tribes of Medina. And we talked about Mecca last week, and the setting of Mecca and how Mecca is different to Medina. Mecca was a city of trade. And just the landscape of Mecca, it was a more harsher environment. I mean, if you've been to Mecca, you'll notice there's mountains all around the Kaaba, maybe less now because of all the malls and hotels are making. But in the past, it was literally surrounded by mountains, and so it was a different environment to the extent where if it rained, you'll even see old photographs from the 1940s, I believe, of the Kaaba being flooded, people swimming and doing tawaf while swimming, because there was no drainage system. There's mountains all the way around. Medina is very different. Medina, first of all, it's not just mushrikeen living there. You have the Ahlul Kitab, the Jews living there. And so the Jews have a rich history with regards to the books they were given, with regards to culture and tradition and civilization. They were also very wealthy in Medina. In fact, they were the ones who owned the land, and it was the Ansar or the Muslims in Medina, or just the people in Medina, who were working the lands of the Jews, and they were the ones who were the workers. The Jews were the ones who were lending out the land, paying the workers, and they were the ones who lived in forts. They had forts that they would live in, whereas the Arabs would just have simple, basic madhas that they would live in. And the trade was different. The trade was agriculture in Medina. It wasn't trade. And so the Prophet ﷺ is going from one to the other. And of course, the hijrah itself is in of itself is a huge miracle. But the companions, when they traveled to Medina, many of them struggled because it's a different world for them. Of course, in those days, people wouldn't travel that much anyway. There's no trains or cars or aeroplanes. And so to move to another place was unheard of. Because if you move from one place to another, if you move from your hometown, your city to another city, you're essentially wavering the protection that your tribe gives you. And so you're going somewhere else where you're exposed, unless you can find protection elsewhere. And so it was unheard of that you would betray your tribe, leave your tribe, the loyalty that you're supposed to show your tribe, the loyalty that they're supposed to show to you, and go somewhere else. On top of this, the climate was different, the food is of course different, because just like, for example, when we move to another country, we struggle. For them, it's like a different country, except they're speaking the same language. And so the climate's different, the weather's different, the environment is different, the trade and the business, the economic nature of the city is different. So it was a trial and tribulation for them. And the Prophet, as we just mentioned, he made a treaty with the Jews. What was this treaty? The treaty, to summarize, was essentially that if anybody decided to attack Medina, we would all come together and we would defend Medina, which is a fairly fair treaty to make and an agreement to make. Just like, for example, you guys in St. Albans, if Luton came to attack St. Albans, okay, sure, that would happen. But if you guys came together, you would expect everybody in St. Albans to defend St. Albans, regardless of background or where you come from or what your religion may be, because you're all living here. So this was the agreement that was made by the Prophet ﷺ with the Jews.
But the idea of a prophet was one who would give them dominion, not one who made the Jews republic. Others of every Arab might happen to believe as they did. When they realized that they could not use the prophet, they tried to shake his faith and his mission, and to seduce his followers, behavior in which they were encouraged secretly by some professing Muslims who considered they had reason to resent the prophet's coming, since they robbed them of their local influence.
Yeah, and from the leaders of the hypocrites was who? Abdullah ibn Ubayy. And it said that he was one of the senior members of the people of Medina, from the tribes of Medina. And it's also said that he would have been maybe the leader of Medina if it wasn't for the fact that the Prophet ﷺ had come to Medina. And so there's an element of jealousy, there's an element of hatred, there's an element of tribalism, because he's not from the tribe of Medina. There's two main tribes of Medina, by the way, from the Arabs, Aus and Khazraj. These were the two main tribes of Medina from the Arabs. And so when the Prophet ﷺ comes, and of course the treaty was such between the Ansar of Medina and the Prophet ﷺ that they would show him support. He would be the leader of them in Medina. Why do they need a leader? Of course, first of all, he's the Prophet ﷺ. Secondly, for decades, Aus and Khazraj, these two tribes, had always been at war with each other. There'd been like a civil war between them, to the extent where the senior members of both tribes had been killed. So it was almost like there was a power vacuum. There was nobody really who could, make peace between them. Everyone come together. Everyone's tired of war. They want somebody to just come together, bring everyone together, and move forward and flourish as a city. And so the Jews, especially Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, who was from the hypocrites, was happy. And you never had hypocrites in Mecca. You only had them in Medina. Why did you only have them in Medina? There were never hypocrites in Mecca. Okay, good. Yes, they're not large in number in Medina. So what does that mean then? I mean, in Mecca they were large in number. Yeah.
I mean that more opportunity like
Okay, so what would be the benefit of somebody, for example, being a hypocrite in Medina as opposed to Mecca?
Is it because if you're a hypocrite in Medina, majority of people are Muslims there, so you get protection from the Muslims. Because if you're not one of them, then
And in Mecca?
In Mecca, it's opposite around because a lot of people there, Islam wasn't strong.
So is there any benefit in being a hypocrite in Mecca? There's no benefit. Why is somebody a hypocrite? Because they're taking the benefit of both sides. In public, they're pretending they're Muslim. In private, they're taking all the benefits of not being a Muslim. But in Mecca, there's no benefit if you're a Muslim. And of course, if you look at the status and the levels of companions, you mentioned this last week, the ones who are higher in status, of course, they're all companions, but the ones who are higher in status are the Muhajirun, the ones from Mecca. That's why the Khulafa Rashidun, the leaders, were all from Mecca. Because the ones in Mecca, they were Muslim when there was no benefit in being a Muslim, like worldly benefit. There was no need for anyone to accept Islam for money, or for power, for strength, or influence, or status, whatever it was. There was no need. And so when somebody became Muslim, it was a sign of their ikhlas, a sign of their sincerity, and a sign of their iman. And so that's why in Medina you had munafiqeen. These people, they thought, okay, well, they want to become Muslims, so we're going to be the odd ones that don't become Muslims, so we'll accept Islam.
In the Medina surahs, there's frequent mention of these Jews in Shaykh. The first conditions. The Prophet ﷺ's first concern for public worship and laid down the constitution of the states. But he did not forget that Quraysh had sworn to make an end to his religion, nor that he had received command to fight against them till they ceased from persecution. After 12 months in Medina, several small expeditions went out, led either by the Prophet ﷺ himself or the migrants for the purpose of reconnoitering and of dissuading the tribes from siding with Quraysh. One of the other purposes of those expeditions may have been to accustom the Meccan Muslims to engage with the enemy forces.
Yeah, so essentially what's happening now is they're in a state of war. The Meccans tried to kill the Prophet ﷺ before he left. They tried to kill him when he was making the hijrah because they knew the dangers of what would happen if he did leave. So you're in a state of war now. And so the Prophet ﷺ would send out expeditions. He would send out the companions to raid the caravans. It's also said that many of the companions, they left Mecca without their belongings, without their possessions. And so there was influx of treasures, wealth that the Meccans had after the Muslims left, because they had the Muslims' wealth that they kept for themselves, they stole. And so many of the caravans that would travel, they would have the wealth of Muslims, and so they felt it was their right to take whatever they needed, because this is a state of war, first of all. The wealth that they had wasn't given to them. A famous example of Suhaib al-Rumi. Suhaib al-Rumi was a very famous companion from the Roman Empire. Interestingly, he wasn't actually a Roman. He was called Suhaib the Roman, but he was actually Arab. But he was captured when he was younger, And he lived in the Roman Empire. And he grew up as a Roman, speaking the Roman language. And when he came back to Mecca as a slave, he had the accent and he even had light hair, light colored hair. He looked like a Roman too, but he wasn't actually a Roman. The point being, he accepted Islam. He managed to make enough money as a businessman to free himself. Shows how successful he was. And when he became Muslim, they imprisoned him. He tried to leave, but they kept him, under close eye. And eventually, he managed to escape. And he grabbed the horse. He had a bow and arrow, and he tried to escape. When they tried to catch up to him, he stopped and he turned around and tried to threaten them with his arrows. And they said to him, "You're not allowed to leave. You have to tell us where your money is." He told them, "If I tell you where my wealth is, when you leave me alone, you let me go." They said, "Yes." So he told them, and when they found out he was telling the truth, they said to him, "You can't leave on that horse. That horse belongs to us." Imagine you're leaving settlements in your car, and the government comes and says, "You can't take that car, it belongs to us." It's this idea of nationality, this nationalism. That we're from we're Mecca. You are just a slave. You're not permitted to go. You're not part of this place. So it's almost like it's racism. And so he gave them the horse, and he was the only companion to make the hijrah by foot. He walked from Mecca to Medina. And when he went to Medina, the Prophet ﷺ saw him, and of course he had been inspired with regards to Suhaib anhu's situation. And he told Suhaib al-Rumi, as soon as he came to the masjid, he said, "Verily, your transaction has been successful also." Meaning, what you give for the sake of Allah, what you have in return is something which Allah is pleased with and He's accepted from. So that's one example. There's many other examples.
30 years that the strict has this. It's clear. That it's like they're fighting to be in order to.
So yeah, in Medina, in Mecca, they weren't allowed to fight. Why weren't they allowed to fight? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hadn't commanded them. They weren't allowed to fight, even though some of the companions would complain to the Prophet, "What's happening to us? We're being oppressed, why can't we fight?" There was no command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them to fight. And again, this shows us in the miraculous nature of the Prophet, because he would have been justified to fight back if necessary. And by the end, you had dignitaries, you had special companions who were from a high status, Umar radiallahu anhu, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Hamza radiallahu anhu. You had all of these companions. But it was a command from Allah. So they weren't allowed to fight in Mecca. It was only now that they're in Medina that they're able and they've been given permission by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fight.
The campaign of Badr. In the second year after Hijrah, the Meccan merchants' caravan, which had confiscated possessions of the Muslims had left Mecca, was returned from Syria as usual by the road which passed not far from Medina. As its leader Abu Sufyan approached their territory of Medina, he heard the Prophet's plan to capture the caravan. Once he sent the camel rider towards Mecca, arriving in a worn-out state and shouted frantically and invited to Quraysh to hasten to the rescue, unless they wished to leave for well.
And it shows Abu Sufyan, who eventually became a Muslim, it shows his intelligence, it shows his wisdom. He sensed that the people from Medina, from the city of Medina, were scouting and they were watching. And he came across an abandoned camp, and he saw camel dropping. And he started to sift through the camel droppings. Sounds a bit gross, but he started sifting through the camel droppings, and he noticed that from the camel droppings were certain plants that you only get in Medina. They said they're here, they're trying to raid the caravan. And so he made an emergency warning, sent an emergency warning to the people of Mecca, to the Quraysh, telling them your caravan is in danger. And apparently it was a very successful trade that was that had gone to the Roman Empire, and it had lots of wealth in that caravan that was returning. And so Abu Sufyan was very wary of what might happen if it was captured. Lots of people in Mecca would lose their wealth and the profits that they made. Yeah.
So, a force of 1,000 strong was soon on its way to Medina, lest it would seem, with the hope of saving the caravan than with the idea of punishing the raiders. Since the Prophet might have taken the caravan before the force started from Mecca.
And one of the things that's mentioned is that the companions, some of them were scouting and they captured some slaves who were from the army of the Quraysh. and they try to interrogate them to try to understand how many of them are coming from the Quraysh. And they're the slaves, not they're responsible for just feeding and water, the water of the Quraysh, food and clothing, whatever it is, clean, whatever it is, basic things. They have no idea in terms of numbers and food, the army, etc., etc. And so the Prophet ﷺ told them, just leave them, they don't understand. He said to them, how many camels do you slaughter every single? And they said 10. And he said, they have 1,000 people. Just from that interrogation, he could figure out how many of the Quraysh were coming to attack Muslims.
Did the Prophet attend? In Ibn Hisham, in the account of the Tabuk expedition, it stated that the Prophet on that one occasion did not hide the objective. The caravan was pretext in the campaign, but the real objective was making it.
So Ibn Hisham, by the way, who is Ibn Hisham? Ibn Hisham is one of the oldest, if not the oldest Muslim historian who wrote about the Seerah of the Prophet. And he took his information from another book written by a scholar by the name of Ibn Ishaq. And Ibn Ishaq's work doesn't exist anymore, but it was a much bigger book. The reason why it was much bigger is because every piece of information he would have, Ibn Ishaq this is, he would always mention a chain of narration, where he got this information from. So literally, you might have a whole page of the chain of narration. They're just a few sentences of the actual information. And this is every single thing. And also, he would talk about things prior to the seerah of the Prophet, stories prior to the life of the Prophet, of other companions. And also, he would mention other things, for example, minute details, maybe details that weren't as important. For example, the names of the swords and the animals of the companions of the Prophet, etc. So Ibn Hisham came, took all of those things out, and just kept the core of the seerah of the Prophet. So it was a much more summarized version. And Ibn Ishaq doesn't exist anymore, but they did find an old copy. They found an old copy of Ibn Ishaq. They compared it to Ibn Hisham, and it's more or less identical. Meaning the version of Ibn Hisham is basically just taken from Ibn Ishaq. It's the same thing without the added things, or without the chain of narration and those minute details.
So, he had received command to fight his persecutors, and with the promise of victory, he was prepared to venture against any odds, as well as seen at Badr. For the Muslims, ill-equipped for war, would have despaired if they had known for the first instance that they were to face a well-armed force 3 times their number.
Yeah, so the companions were around 300 or 315, roughly 310, 315, that sort of number. And so they were outnumbered 3 to 1. And the intention wasn't to fight. The intention was to raid caravans. The big difference between raiding caravans and actually having a full-blown out war, because in terms of armor, in terms of weaponry, it's something which requires a lot more preparation, a lot more effective weapons. If you're fighting, an army that's to fight. When the Quraysh were told that the caravan safe, because Abu Sufyan diverted, took another route, he sent another message telling them the caravan is safe. There's no need to fight. Abu Jahl, who was the leader of the Quraysh, insisted on fighting. He said, no, we're going to continue. We're going to enjoy the stay. They have brought their slaves with them. They brought their women with them. They brought alcohol. They were thinking this is going to be a nice party. We're going to kill the Muslims. We're going to enjoy ourselves, have fun. And so they severely underestimated the Muslims. And also, this is a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that they defeated the Quraysh at this battle, as we'll mention inshallah, is nothing short of a miracle. And all the senior people of the Quraysh were killed. Abu Jahl, others, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, and others, they were killed. Al-Walid ibn Mughira, yeah.
The army of Quraysh advanced more than halfway to Medina before the Prophet set out. All 3 parties, the army of Quraysh, Muslim army in the caravan, heading for the water of Badr. Abu Sufyan, the leader of the caravan, heard from one of his scouts Muslims were near the water. He turned back to the coast plain, leaving the Muslims to meet the army of Quraysh by the well of Badr. Before the battle, the Prophet was prepared, still further to increase the odds against him. He gave leave to all the natives of Medina, Ansar, to return to their homes unreproached, since their oath did not include the duty of fighting in the field. But the Ansar were only hurt by the suggestion that they could possibly desert him at the time of danger.
So the treaty was that the Muslims from Medina, the Ansar, would defend the Prophet where? In Medina. And so this again shows us how the Prophet wanted to be fair and just with regards to the conditions of the treaty. But they were the ones who insisted, no, regardless of what happens, we are with you, O Messenger of Allah, wherever you go, whenever you need any kind of assistance, we're going to be there to help.
The battle went back against the Muslims, but against the odds, with a much weaker army, they were victorious. The victory of Badr gave the Prophet ﷺ new prestige among the Arab tribes. But thenceforth, there were the feud of blood between Quraysh and the Islamic State, in addition to the old religious hatred. First passages of the Quran, which refer to the Battle of Badr, give warning of much greater struggles yet to come.
So obviously, this was the greatest victory that the Muslims had faced up until now, and it was a pivotal moment in Islamic history for the companions and for the Prophet ﷺ. Many of the senior members of Quraysh had been killed: Abu Jahl, Abu ibn Mughira, Umayy ibn Khalaf, and of course, this was a statement. The statement was that this group, this ragtag group of people who were from random tribes, ex-slaves, people who were like from lowly tribes who were just come together and they're living down in Medina, that they're a force to be reckoned with because they've just defeated the greatest tribe in Arabia, the Quraysh. And so people were now, were noticed, the Muslims. And of course, there are many stories that we can mention about the Battle of Badr, how Iblis accompanied the Quraysh up until the battlefield, and then he turned and fled. When they asked him where he was going, they tried to stop him. He pushed them away, and they went flying because, of course, it's Iblis. But he came in the form of a human being, and he said, "Inni ara ma la tarawun." He said, "I see what you don't see. Inni akhafullah. Verily, I fear Allah." This is Iblis. And he saw the angels descending who were going to fight alongside the Muslims. And many stories are mentioned about the battles. Narrations mention that some of the companions said that when we would raise our swords to attack the enemy, we would hear the sound of a whip. And then those enemies that we were about to attack, they would fall without us hitting. Meaning the angels were fighting with them. And also, narrations mention after the battle, they would see some bodies that had been cleanly cut from head to toe, right down the middle. Clean cut. And of course, no human being can do this. It was the angels who were participating in the battle. And of course, there's other stories about Bilal radiallahu anhu killing his ex-master, Umayy ibn Khalaf, and other narrations as well of some of the younger companions. There were two companions who killed Abu Jahl, Mu'adh and Mu'awwid. These were two companions, young companions from Medina. Young companions in their teens, around 14, 15 years old, or 16, 17 years old. They were contributing and fighting in the battle. Both of them became shuhada in the battle. But they were the ones who fought and killed Abu Jahl. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was also one of the final ones who laid the final blow to Abu Jahl. And it's mentioned that Mu'adh Mu'awwid, he was fighting and he injured his arm to the extent where his arm wasn't working in him. He couldn't use his arm. He was just dangling. He was still fighting, carrying on fighting even though his arm wasn't working. And then the arm was getting in the way, so he stepped on his hand and he ripped his own armor. Because the arm was still attached, but it was useless because the veins had been cut. It was just hanging off by some tendon. So he holds his own hand and he rips his own armor. And just thinking about this, subhanAllah, it makes you think, the level of toughness, the strength that these individuals had at that time is so a different level. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides strength to whomsoever He wishes. Yeah.
In fact, the following year, an army of 3,000 Mecca destroyed Medina. The Prophet's first idea was merely to defend the city, a plan of which Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the hypocrites, Muslim only by name, strongly approved. But the men who had fought at Badr believed that Allah would help them against any odds, thought it a shame that they should linger behind walls.
So the younger companions came forward and said, "No, Messenger of Allah, we want to fight outside against the Quraysh. We don't want to stay in the city of Medina," even though that was what the more experienced companions had said. And so the Prophet ﷺ agreed or decided to listen to them, and he prepared to fight the Quraysh outside of Medina. And the younger companions were rebuked. They were told, "Why did you do this?" Obviously, they wanted to fight because they missed out on Badr. So they wanted to, get some action, essentially. And so they felt bad. They went back to the Prophet ﷺ and he said that no messenger dons his armor to fight and then takes it off unless he's fought, except after he's fought. And so the decision had already been made.
The battle on Mount Uhud. The Prophet ﷺ, proven of their faith and zeal, gave way to them, set out with an army of 1,000 men to dismount. where the enemy were encamped.
Who was the leader of the Quraysh now? So Battle Badr was Abu Jahl, Abu Sufyan. So Abu Sufyan is now the leader of Quraysh. Previously, he wasn't at that level. So the level of Abu Jahl, Umayy ibn Khalaf, these individuals, they're one level higher, but they're all being killed. And so he's the next one, essentially, who is in line, if you like, to be the leader of the Quraysh. And so he decides to be the leader, and they choose him as the leader. And he also decides to prepare for the Battle of Uhud. Almost straight after the Battle of Badr and the news of the loss of Battle of Badr arrives in Mecca, that's when he decides we need to make preparations to fight. So almost a year later, they leave to fight the Muslims at the Battle of Uhud. And another major difference is that in the first battle, a very famous warrior and Muslim general was there. He's not a Muslim at the time. At Mount Uhud, he's on the side of the non-Muslim. Who is this? Khalid ibn Walid. Khalid ibn Walid, radiallahu anhu, became a Muslim later. He's at the Battle of Uhud. He will play an important part as well.
Yeah. Abdullah ibn Ubay was much offended by the change of plan. He thought it was unlikely that the Prophet ﷺ really meant to give battling conditions so adverse to the Muslims, and was unwilling to take part in a mere demonstration designed to flatter Muslims. So he withdrew his men, 4 or so of the army.
I mean, it's understandable if you make your objections known while you're in Medina. But to accompany the army, then go halfway, and then decide to backtrack and just drift away from the actual army and go back home and start complaining as you're walking away, that's a sign of, well, nifaq, it's a sign of real hypocrisy and cowardice and just, evil intentions, which is, of course, what the munafiqeen do.
Despite the heavy odds, the Battle of Mount Uhud would have been an even greater victory than at Badr for the Muslims, but for the disobedience of a band of 50 archers whom the Prophet ﷺ set to guard a pass, they passed against enemy cavalry.
So you have Mount Uhud. Mount Uhud is around 1 kilometer wide. It's a range of mountains. And you have a smaller mountain south of Mount Uhud, which is called Jabal al-Rumah. It's now called Archer's Mount. And it's bigger, it was bigger then than it is now. If any of you have been for Umrah or Hajj, maybe you've seen the Archer's Mount. And so the companions, they encamped between Mount Uhud and Archer's Mount. Why? And again, it shows us the tactical genius of the Prophet ﷺ, because they're protected from two sides. And the enemy can only attack from one side. And of course, he was worried they may flank and go around the mountain, around Jabal al-Rumah, the Archer's Mount. And so he has 50 archers on the Archer's Mount to make sure that if anybody does try to flank the Muslims and go from behind, that they'll be prevented. And this was the plan. And he told them, even if you see the enemy and you see birds picking from our dead bodies, you don't leave from the mount until you've been given permission, until you've been commanded. Very strict and very specific instructions. But of course, the companions, when they saw the Muslims winning the battle, and essentially it was as if the battle had been won. I mean, the narrations mention that it was as if the battle had been won. It was the Quraysh were running away from the battle. It looked like as if the battle was over. And so they went down and they thought that the battle was over because they saw the spoils of war being taken by the other companions, and they wanted to also take some of the spoils of war.
Seeing their comrades victorious, these men left their posts, ready to lose their share of the spoils. The cavalry of Quraysh rode through the gap and fell on the exultant Muslims. The Prophet himself was wounded in the fire forest and he was slain, till someone recognized him and shouted that he was still living, a shout to which all the Muslims rallied. Gathering around the Prophet, they retreated, leaving many dead on the hillside. On the following day,
so from them, Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, radiallahu anhu, other companions also were killed at this battle. And scholars differ with regards to whether or not this battle was a success or a loss to the Muslims. It's an interesting kind of debate that the scholars have with regards to this battle. Even though Khalid ibn Walid flanked the Muslims when he saw the Muslims come down from Archer's Mount, he flanked the Muslims, attacked from behind, and many losses were incurred upon the Muslims. The first ones to leave the battlefield were the Quraysh. The Muslims were still there. In fact, when the Quraysh left, the Muslims went back to Medina The Prophet ﷺ told them, we need to go out of Medina again just to make sure they don't come back and try to finish the job. So they were ready to fight again. But the Quraysh never came back. So some scholars say this wasn't a loss. They say it was a victory. Because they were the first ones to leave the battlefield without finishing the job. They were still there, ready to fight. Others, they say it was a draw. Because the Quraysh had a goal, they never accomplished that goal, to kill the Prophet ﷺ, to defeat all the Muslims, to rid the world of Islam and Tawheed. And the Muslims, of course, weren't victorious either. So they say it was a draw. Some say it was a loss with regards to the numbers. So more Muslims were killed as opposed to Quraysh. So they say in this way it was a loss. But everyone agrees that it was a defeat, it was a loss because they decided to disobey the instructions of the Prophet. So from that perspective, it was a failure. It was a loss. Why? Because they disobeyed the rules or the commands given by the Prophet. During the battle, they disobeyed. And that was the reason why the battle ended how it ended. And so the scholars agree, and they take lessons from this, that when a person disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he isn't going to be given success. When you obey Allah and you obey the Messenger, yes, there's trials, tribulations, like of course in Mecca, the companions had the trials and tribulations. In Medina now, with the Munafiqeen leaving the battlefield, essentially, there's always going to be trials and tribulations, but the end result will always be with Allah and His Messenger and with the Muslims. But when a person disobeys Allah and disobeys the Prophet ﷺ, there's always going to be loss and disappointment in a person's life, and especially in the Akhirah.
On the following day, the Prophet again ventured forth with the intention that the Quraysh might hear that he was in the field, and so might perhaps be deterred from attacking the city. The stratagem succeeded, thanks to the behavior of the friendly men, who met the Muslims and conversed with them, and afterwards questioned by Abu Sufyan, he said that Muhammad was in the field, stronger than ever, thirsting for the revenge of yesterday's affair. On that information, Abu Sufyan decided to return except Muslim Muslims. The reverse which they had suffered on Mount Uhud lowered the prestige of the Muslims with Arab tribes and also with the Jews of Medina. The tribes had inclined toward the Muslims, now inclined toward the Quraysh. The Prophet's followers were attacked and murdered when they went abroad in little companies. Ubay, one of his envoys, was captured by a desert tribe and sold to Quraysh, who tortured him to death in Mecca. The expulsion of Banu Nadir. The Jews, despite their treaty, now hardly concealed their hostility. They went even so far in flattery of Quraysh as to declare the religion of the pagan Arabs superior to Islam.
So they're essentially what they're doing now is they want to ally with the Quraysh to attack the Muslims. And even though both are from Ahlul Kitab, meaning we have a book and they have a book, they decided to flatter the Quraysh by saying your religion is better than his religion. Even though it doesn't make any sense because the Jews have a book and the Quraysh don't even have a book. They have just idols that they worship. The Jews believe in the idea or the principle of one God, even though of course it's distorted. And of course the Muslims also have the same principle of Tawheed. But it was them uniting with the Quraysh. So they're changing sides.
The Prophet ﷺ was obliged to take punitive action against some of them. The tribe of Banu Nadir were besieged in the strong towers, subdued and forced to immigrate. The hypocrites had sympathized with the Jews and secretly egged them on. The War of the Trench.
So this is the third major battle. The first battle was Badr, which was a victory. The second battle was Uhud, which was a loss. And this is now the third battle, the Battle of Khandaq.
The War of the Trench. In the 5th year of the Hijrah, the isolated made a great plan, the War of the Clans of the War of the Trench.
It's also called Ahzab, the clans, because all confederates, because all of the tribes of Arabia united together to try to destroy Islam and the Muslims. So it's called Al-Ahzab. The Surah Al-Ahzab talks about this battle as well. And it's also called Khandaq because of the trench that they dug.
When Quraysh, with all their clans, the great desert tribe of Qatfan with their clans, an army of 10,000 men rode against Medina. The Prophet ﷺ, by the advice of Salman the Persian, caused a deep trench to be dug before the city, and himself led the work of digging.
Salman al-Farsi was a companion from Persia, and he was a fire worshipper initially. and then he became a Christian, and then after many years of searching for the truth, he ended up in Medina as a slave, and he heard about the coming of the Prophet ﷺ from Mecca, and he accepted Islam. Some narrations mention he was around 80 years old when he accepted Islam. So he's very old in age. And narrations mention he was over 100 when he passed away.
The army of the clans was stopped by the trench, a novelty in Arab warfare, seemed impassable for cavalry, which formed their strength. They camped in sight and daily showered their arrows and its defenders.
Yeah, so the idea of building a trench was given by Salman radiallahu anh, because this was a tactic they used in Persia. They were outnumbered. So it was like a strategy. I'm sure you've seen castles in the past that have moats. The moat is what's surrounding the castle, it's just water around the castle. That's a defensive strategy so that you can't attack the castle. And they have like one access way, one entrance to the castle with the drawbridge that they lower to allow people to come in. So a similar kind of thing. It's a defensive maneuver, defensive measure to protect themselves from the Quraysh. Quraysh never seen this, by the way. They had never seen anything like this before. They come, they're about to fight. They see a massive trench dug. They don't know what to do. They go all the way around the area where the trench was dug. On the other side, it was just mountains. They couldn't cross from that side, and it was being defended by the companions anyway. There was nothing they could do, and it was winter. And while they were there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed there would be sandstorms. And so they were struggling in terms of the living conditions, sand went into everything. They had limited food, limited supplies, limited water, and the nights were cold, and there were fires every time they tried to make a fire for food or for warmth. The fire would go out because of the winds, because of the sandstorms. So it was a very, difficult time for the Muslims also, because their trade routes had been cut off. No more food was coming into Medina because the Quraysh were outside. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had planned that the difficulty would be upon the Quraysh also, to such an extent that they weren't able to stay there. Yeah.
While the Muslims were waiting themselves, news came that Banu Qurayza, the Jewish tribe from Medina, which had till then been loyal.
So Banu Qurayza have also now sided with the enemy. They've also sided with the enemy. And they're in Medina. So imagine, like, again, St. Albans, you have like a certain section. You're supposed to be defending yourself against Luton, and they decide to basically go ahead and renege against people in St. Albans and unite with Luton, ally with Luton. So you're worried about Luton, and you're worried about this minor group, this small group within St. Albans itself. So it's very stressful. It's something that makes things so much harder. You're not just focusing with an exterior enemy, you're focusing on an enemy that's amongst you in your own city. So it became very stressful for the Muslims.
The case being desperate, but the delay caused by the trench had dampened the zeal of clans. One who was secretly a Muslim managed to sow distrust between Quraysh and the Jewish allies, so that both hesitated to act. Then came a bitter wind from the sea, which blew for 3 days and nights so terrible that not a tent could be kept standing, not a fire lighted, not a pot boiled.
So some narrations mention Abu Sufyan. He had decided, let me just go to Banu Qurayza and we'll tell them once and for all of us should unite and we'll just attack tomorrow. So he told them, he sent a message to tell them, we're not going to fight tomorrow. We can't fight. The Quraysh said, why can't you fight tomorrow? They said, it's Saturday. And they said, so what? It's Saturday. It's Sunday, Friday, it doesn't make a difference. We need to fight. We need to fight the Muslims. They said, no, it's our Yom Sabbath, our Sabbath. They said, so what if it's your Saturday? What does that mean? They said, we don't do anything on Saturday. And the Quraysh from Mecca, they don't know about this tradition. It's what do you mean don't do anything on Saturday? They say we don't fight on Saturday, we're not allowed to do anything, we're just allowed to sit and worship, we don't fight, we don't do business. So the Quraysh are thinking, these guys are lying, they're just betraying us, they're just using these excuses to not fight, they betrayed us. But of course, from their perspective, they wouldn't fight on the Saturday. So there was lots of mistrust amongst the different confederates, amongst the different tribes of the Arabs and amongst the Jews, and eventually the unity just had collapsed because, of course, it's based upon falsehood and batil anyway. And so eventually the decision had been made by Abu Sufyan for them to leave. In fact, he said, I'm leaving. If anyone wants to stay, they can just stay. I'm going. I've had enough. So he went on his camel, he rode off, and they saw him leaving, and they joined him as well. Yeah.
The tribesmen were in misery. And then one night, the leader of the nation woman could be warned no longer, gave order to retire. When the Ghatafan woke next morning they found Quraysh had gone, and they too took their baggage and retreated. Punishment of Banu Qurayza. On the day of the return from the trench, Prophet ﷺ ordered war on the treacherous Banu Qurayza, who, conscious of their guilt, had already taken to their towers of refuge. After a siege of nearly a month, they had to surrender unconditionally. They only begged that they might be judged by a member of the Arab tribe of which they were adherents. The Prophet ﷺ judge upon whose favor they had counted.
The judge was Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, famous leader of the Muslims in Medina, the Ansar, and he had been injured at the battle. So he said, I'll judge you based on your own book. And your own book said that you should be executed. So it's like as if they shot themselves in the foot. And he died shortly after this from his wounds. The Prophet ﷺ said, اهتز العرش, that the arsh of the most merciful shook when Sa'd ibn Mu'adh died, which shows us the status of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, great companion of the Prophet ﷺ from Medina.
But the judge, on whose favor they had counted, condemned their white men to death, and women and children to slavery. Early in the 6th year of Hijrah, the Prophet led campaign against Bani al-Mustaliq, a tribe who were prepared to attack Muslims. Al-Hudaybiyah. In the same year, the Prophet had a vision in which he found himself entering the holy place of Mecca unopposed. Therefore, he was determined to attempt the pilgrimage. Tired as pilgrims and taking with them the customary of offerings, a company of 1,400 men journeyed to Mecca. As they drew near the Holy Valley, they met in the city. They had warned the Prophet that Quraysh had put on their leopard skins the badge of valor and swore to prevent his entering the sanctuary. Their cavalry was on the road before him.
And this was unheard of. The Quraysh would never stop anybody from performing the pilgrimage and coming to Mecca. To the extent where we said before that the worst enemy and the killer of someone's father would be seen performing tawaf and no one would, even though the tribes were always at war. If they were in that area, they were safe. And so for them now to not allow the Muslims to do tawaf and to come and perform pilgrimage, it was unheard of. They'd never done that before. It was almost like going against your beliefs and the honorable thing that you used to do with everybody else. It seems like that double standards are now being applied to the Muslims that you normally apply to everybody else.
On that sort of summer, with the detour through mountain gorges, the Muslims were tired out. They came down at last into the valley of Mecca and camped at a spot called Al-Hudaybiyah. From here, he tried to open negotiations with Quraysh to explain that he came only as a pilgrim. The first messenger he sent towards the city was maltreated and his camel hamstrung. He returned with delivering his message. Without delivering his message. Quraysh on their side sent an envoy which was threatening manner, very arrogant. Another of their envoys was too familiar and had been reminded sternly of the respect due to the Prophet. It was he who, on his return to the city, said, I have seen Caesar and Khosroes in their pomp, but never have seen a man honored is honored by his parents.
Yes, the Quraysh are noticing the amount of love and respect that people have for the Prophet. And for them, it's surprising because, they're not from the same tribe. Even today, we show loyalty to our own family. We have this loyalty, this love, this closeness. And they were surprised because you have essentially for them a ragtag random group of people that have come together, different tribes, different countries, different backgrounds, and they have so much love and reverence and respect for the Prophet. It was something that they've never seen before.
Prophet saw some messenger who would impose respect. Uthman was finally chosen because of his kinship with the powerful royal family. While the Muslims were waiting his return, the news came that he had been murdered. It was then that the Prophet sitting under a tree and in Hudaybiyah took an oath from his comrades they would stand or fall together. After a while, he knowing that man had not been murdered.
So he had been murdered, but the negotiations had continued for a long time. And so they made this treaty that if he had been killed, they would fight the Quraysh if that was the case. And this was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. It was taken under a tree which Allah mentions in the Quran. لقد رضي الله عن المؤمنين إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة. Allah says, verily Allah is pleased with the believers who gave you their pledge under the tree. So Allah mentions those people who gave their pledge of allegiance to the Prophet that they would fight. Why? Because it wasn't a situation where they were expected to fight. And so they literally put their lives on the line for the sake of Allah, for the sake of the Prophet.
A troop which came out from the city to molest the Muslims in their camp was captured before they could do any hurt and walk before the Prophet, who gave them on the promise to renounce hostility. The truth of Hudaybiyah. Then proper envoys came. After some negotiation, the truth of Hudaybiyah was signed. For 10 years, there were to be no hostilities between the parties. The Prophet was to return to Medina without visiting the camp. But in the following year, he might form the pilgrimage with his comrades. Quraysh promised him to evacuate Mecca for 3 days to allow his doing so. Deserters from Quraysh to the Muslims during the period of the truth were to be returned. Not so deserters from the Muslims to Quraysh.
So essentially, anyone who left Mecca and joined the Muslims had to be given back. Anyone who left the Muslims and joined the Quraysh wouldn't be given back. They were allowed to stay with the Quraysh. Now, this actually didn't seem fair, but the Quraysh were so overconfident in thinking that people would leave the Muslims, they didn't realize that they shot themselves. Because anybody who joins Islam and is seen as it was, joins for the right reasons, never leaves. And more people left, and less people went back to Quraysh, went back to idolatry and shirk after they had accepted Islam. And so, in hindsight, it was actually a blessing because there was no fighting for 10 years. That was actually the agreement. But because there was open da'wah now, no one was going to fight. Tribes were open to ally with either the Quraysh or the Muslims. And there was open da'wah. There was no restriction. No one was going to stop anybody else from calling others to Islam in the whole of Arabia.
Any tribe or clan wished to share in the treaty as allies. Any tribe or clan wished to share in the treaty as allies of Quraysh, not do so. There was dismay among the Muslims at these terms. They asked one another, where is the victory that we were promised? It was during the return journey of Hudaybiyah. Surah entitled The Conquest, Surah 48, was revealed.
Which surah is this? The Fath. Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. Allah says, we have given you a manifest clear victory. And this was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Yeah. And some scholars they said this is referring to the Fath of Makkah, conquest of Makkah. But they're both connected because as a result of this treaty, eventually the Muslims were able to conquer Mecca.
The truth proved, in fact, to be the greatest victory the Muslims had till then achieved. War had been a barrier between them and identity, and now both parties met to talk together, and the religion spread more rapidly. In 2 years, which elapsed between the signing of the truce and the fall of Mecca, the number of converts was greater than the total number of previous converts. The Prophet traveled to Hudaybiyah 1400 men. 2 years later, when the Meccans broke the truce, he marched again with an army of 10,000 men.
So within 2 years, from 1400, you have 10,000. From 1,400, now you have 10,000. This really shows us how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aids Islam and the Muslims. And also it shows us the effectiveness of peace and how da'wah can be so effective when there's no wars taking place. When people are open to dialogue, discussion, and conversation like we are today, it's a beautiful opportunity to call others to Islam, to have dialogue, to discuss, to talk, to have conversations about Islam. Because there's no fear of aggression or violence. It's very easy for a person to give da'wah to call others to Islam. So, we take a break or? 9, isn't it? 9.
Is it 9?
Yeah, 9. Yeah. So we've got 25 minutes. I don't mind. We'll stop. Take a break for 5 minutes.
We stop for 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5-minute break? That's fine. Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break. Subhanallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Yeah. No. Yeah, favorite.
So the campaign of Khaybar. In the third year after the Hijrah, with the campaign of Khaybar, stronghold of the Jewish tribes of North Arabia, which had become a hornet's nest of its enemies. The force of Khaybar were reduced one by one. The Jews of Khaybar became inevitable tents of Muslims until the expulsion of Jews from Arabia and the caliphate of Umar. On the day when the last war surrendered, Ja'far, son of Khalid, the Prophet's first cousin, arrived with all who remained Muslims and fled to Abyssinia to escape from persecution in the early days. They had been absent from Arabia for 15 years. It was at Khaybar that a Jewess prepared for the Prophet's poisoned meat, for which he only tasted a morsel without swallowing it. And then warned his comrades that it was poisoned.
So one of the Jewish women poisoned food that the Prophet ate, and he was informed of it by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so he never died from the poisoning. But it said that the poisoning affected him throughout the rest of his life, and when he died, they say it was from the remnants of poison that caused him to become ill and pass. But you wouldn't say he was murdered, because it was many, many years after this specific incident, so you wouldn't necessarily call it death murder.
One Muslim who had already swallowed the mouth immediately, Prophet himself, the mere taste of it, derived the illness which eventually caused his death. The woman who had cooked the meat was all before him. When she said that she had done it on account of the humiliation of her people, he forgave her. Pilgrimage to Mecca. In the following year, his visions filled. He visited the holy place at Mecca unopposed. In accordance with the terms of the truce, the Archelaus evacuated the city. Upon the surrounding heights watched the procedure of Muslims. At the end of the stipulated 3 days, the chiefs of Quraysh sent a reminder to the Prophet. The time was up. He then withdrew and the idolaters reoccupied the city.
So this is the 9th day of the Hijrah.
Expedition. In the 8th year of the Hijrah, hearing that the Byzantine Empire was gathering forces in Syria and destructive Islam, Prophet sent 3,000 men to Syria under the command of his freed slave Zayd radiallahu anhu. The campaign was unsuccessful, except that it impressed Syrians with the notion of reckless valor of Muslims. The 3,000 did not hesitate to join battle with 800,000. When all 3 leaders appointed by the Prophet had been killed, the survivors under the command of Khalid bin Walid, who by his strategy and courage managed to preserve a remnant and return with them to Medina.
Yeah, so Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was the one who was made the leader after Zayd was killed. He also died. Other companions who were made to be in charge by the Prophet if anything was to happen to the other generals were also killed. And so everyone turned to Khalid. Said, you're the most experienced general and soldier, so you should take charge. And then he managed to regroup everybody, and then they retreated back to Medina. This was the beginning of Khalid of the rise with regards to him as a famous Muslim general.
Truth broken by Quraysh. In the same year, Quraysh broke the truce by attacking a tribe in alliance with the Muslims. Then, even in the century afterwards, they were afraid because of Allah. They sent Sufyan to Medina to ask the existing treaty to be renewed, and the terms prolonged.
So essentially, what happened was a tribe that was allied with the Muslims was attacked by a tribe that was allied by the Quraysh, with the Quraysh. And the Quraysh were aware, and in fact, it said that they even provided the weapons and planning to that tribe to kill those people from the tribe that was allied with the Muslims. And it was meant to be a secret affair so that nobody would know that this was happening, or that nobody would know this was a tribe that was attacked by a tribe allied with the Quraysh, so that the treaty wouldn't be broken. But it didn't go to plan, and the plan and their plot was exposed. And so the treaty, in essence, had been broken. Abu Sufyan tried to go to Medina to make a new treaty, realizing, the mistake that was made, realizing the dangers of not having a treaty with the Muslims, because of course the Muslims are stronger and greater in strength and in numbers. But of course, there was no new treaty that was going to be made by the Muslims.
They hoped that he would arrive before the tidings of this. A messenger from the Indian tribe being reported, and his embassy was fruitless. The conquest of Mecca, so some almost capable of very Quraysh were overruled. Their cavalry put a show of defense before the town, but were routed without bloodshed. The Prophet entered his native city on horseback, with his head humbled before Allah.
So Abu Sufyan, when he's in Mecca, he notices a huge army and a huge number of Muslims, well, not Muslims, but 10,000 people approaching Mecca. He's with some of his other friends in Mecca, and they start to ask who are these people who are coming, because they have no idea it's Muslims coming. They weren't expecting anything. And, it's 10,000. They don't know, like, the number of Muslims. And so Abu Sufyan said, oh, this is such a tribe that come to help us against the Muslims. They're going to come and fight with us against the Muslims. Little did they realize this, group of 10,000 strong is actually the Muslims who are going to, liberate and conquer Mecca. And when the Prophet entered Mecca, he entered through three different routes, three different directions, for a number of reasons: to show domination, to show that there's no reason for you to attack. Strategically as well, it was a good move so that they couldn't be attacked and they would have to spread out to attack the Muslims. And it was the element of surprise, because as we said, the Quraysh had no idea that they were going to be attacked by the Muslims. In fact, even the Muslims, even the companions, didn't know where they were going. The Prophet told the companions we're leaving, and the companions left. He never told them where he was going. And when he left Medina, he went the opposite direction, just in case somebody was watching who was a spy from the Quraysh. And then when he left Medina, he turned direction, he went towards.
The inhabitants expected vengeance from the passing seas. The Prophet became the general amnesty. Only a few known criminals were described. Most of those were in their relief and surprise. The population of Mecca hastened to swear allegiance.
So, the famous incident when he asked them, what do you think I'm going to do to you? And they said, Rajul Kareem ibn al-Kareem ibn al-Kareem. They said, you are the most generous person, nicest person, son of the most nicest person, They're butchering the Prophet because they know what they did when the Muslims were in Mecca. Now they know it's not in their hands. And so he says, I will say to you what Yusuf said to his brothers when they came. What did he say? لا تثريب عليكم اليوم يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم. There's no reckoning upon you today. Allah Azza wa Jalla has forgiven you, and He is the most merciful of those who show mercy. He told them, اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. Go, you're free. That is going to happen. And this was such a shock to them, because they really thought that they were going to be executed because of what they did to the Muslims and to the Prophet when he was in Mecca. They weren't expecting. And so they actually accepted Islam as a result of how the Prophet behaved, how he responded to them. And again, this shows us, Rahmah has its power, it has its influence. When you show Rahmah and mercy, it's a different kind of feeling, and it has a way of softening the hearts, unlike other ways, other manners. Yeah.
So, the Prophet calls all idols which were in the sanctuary to be destroyed, saying, truth has come, darkness is vanished, and the Muslims call to prayer or serve the Mecca. That's the name. In the same year, there was an angry gathering of alien tribes eager to regain the camp. Prophet had 12,000 men against deep behind. His troops were ambushed by the enemy and almost to fight. It was with difficulty that they were rallied to the Prophet and bodyguard faithful comrades who alone stood firm.
Yeah, so narrations mentioned that they were awed by their number. The Muslims have such a huge number that they were like awed, they were proud of the numbers. Allah says, وَيَوْمَ حُنَيْنٍ إِذْ أَعْجَبَتْكُمْ كَثْرَتُكُم. The day of Hunayn, Battle of Hunayn, when you were impressed by your numbers. They became like, overconfident in regards to their numbers and how they would be successful in the battles.
But victory came. But the victory, when it came, was complete and the booty enormous. For many of the hostile
So the enemy tribe, they had brought out everything that they owned. Everything. Animals, wealth, money. And so of course when they were defeated, that was all taken as booty as spoils of war by the Muslims.
the conquest of Taif. The tribe of Aqeel was amongst the enemy of the main. After that victory, the city of Taif was besieged by the Muslims, finally reduced. Then the Prophet appointed a governor of Mecca. Himself returned to Medina to the bank of Ansar, who had feared less. Now that he had gained the city, he might forsake them and make Mecca the capital. The Tabuk expedition. In the 9th year of Hijrah, hearing that an army was again being mustered in Syria, Switzerland, on all the support and breaking pain. The far distance, the hot season, the fact that the target sun, and the siege of the enemy caused men to excuse themselves and many more to stay behind without excuse. First the boxers and denounced the Quran. The campaign ended peacefully. Army advanced with the bull and on the confines of Syria.
On the confines.
On the confines.
Confines of Syria.
Confines of Syria. And then learned that the enemy had not yet kept. Declaration of unity. When it had been conquered, its people were now Muslims. The official order of the pilgrimage had not been changed. The pagan Arabs performed it in their manner. This was in their manner. It was only after the pilgrims caravan had left Medina in the 9th year of Hijrah when Islam was dominant in North Arabia, and unity as its rules were aligned. The Prophet sent a copy of it by messenger to Abu Bakr, the leader of the pilgrimage, with instruction that Ali was to read it to the multitudes at Mecca. This declaration was then after that year Muslims only were to make the pilgrimage, exception being made for such of the idolaters as had a treaty with Muslims, had never broken a treaty nor supported anyone against them.
Yeah, so from that time forward, no Muslim was permitted to perform tawaf, perform pilgrimage to the Kaaba unless they were Muslim, because this land is a land of Tawheed, it's a land of the land of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Muslim and Hanifan, the land of truth, not a land of polytheism, but a land of Tawheed and oneness of Allah. And so this land was to be dedicated to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, the Quraysh would have their own strange ways of performing Hajj. They would perform Hajj naked. And so you had all these strange kinds of habits that the Quraysh would have when it came to the Hajj and the Umrah. The Talbiyah had changed. They had changed the Talbiyah, of course, because the Talbiyah, in essence, was about Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. La sharika lak. There's no partners that we ascribe to. And so they had changed Talbiyah, they had changed the whole concept and ideas of the Hajj and the pilgrimage. We have, of course, idols around Mecca. So now that it had been purified, it was only right that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was worshipped and remembered during the Hajj.
Such were to enjoy the privileges, the treaty, for the term thereof. But when the treaty expired, they would be as pieces. That proclamation marks the end of idol worship in Arabia. The years of disputations. The 9th year of Hijrah is the year of disputations, because for all parts of Arabia, disputations came to Medina, swear allegiance to the Prophet and to hear the Quran. The Prophet had become back of Arabia, but his way of life remained simple as before. As we know,
he lived in a very simple house with one room next to the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. He was somebody who wasn't somebody who had lots of wealth. He passed away with smaller few dirhams in his name. He was somebody who didn't care for like the love of this dunya, the love of this world. And so many people started to accept Islam, especially after the conquest of Mecca. When this is what Allah said, so إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح, when the help of Allah comes and victory comes. وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسِ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. You see the people entering into Islam in crowds. Why? When was this revealed? It was revealed after the conquest of Mecca. Why were the people entering into Islam in crowds? Because it said that the majority of the tribes in Arabia were waiting to see what would happen when the Prophet enters Mecca. they're like, okay, you don't know what's going on here. We don't know what his situation is. If he really is a messenger, let's wait and see when he enters Mecca what's going to happen. If Mecca come and fought him and kill all the Muslims, and all those companions killed him, then we know, okay, he was wrong. But the way he entered, the way he conquered Mecca, they realized, okay, he's a messenger of Allah. Because of course they know from the story of the elephant, it's Abu Fil. And so when they realized he's conquered Mecca, there was no bloodshed, he's forgiven everybody, even accepted Islam in Mecca, they realized it must be the religion of truth. And so after this, people would accept Islam in crowds. Whereas before, people would come to Medina, maybe, individually by themselves. Now you would have dozens of people coming together in crowds to accept Islam.
He personally controls every detail of organization, judged every case, in the month and years, he destroyed Arab in Arabia, but his women in the cities, capitals, legal, sea, with them. Effectually stopped the drunkenness and immorality which until then disgraced Arabs, made men in love with faith, sincerity, and honesty, transformed tribes who had been for centuries content with ignorance into a people with the greatest thirst for knowledge. For the first time in history, made universal human brotherhood, fact and principle from the Lord, and his important guide, all that righteous. The federal pilgrimage, in the 10th year of Hijrah, the Prophet was a pilgrim in the lifetime. This pilgrimage farewell, as is called, when from Mount Arafat he reached the enormous throng of pilgrims.
Yeah, so the 9th year of the Hijrah, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the first one to perform Hajj on behalf of the Muslims. Then in the 10th year of the Hijrah was the Hajj of the Prophet. Yeah. Because the last month of the Islamic year, we're in the Hijrah now. And he passed away in which month? In which month did the Prophet pass away? Rabiul Awwal. He was born Rabiul Awwal, he passed in Rabiul Awwal.
He reminded them of all the duties Islam enjoyed from them. Who would judge each one of them according to God. He said, "O people, listen well to my words, for I do not know when after this year I shall be amongst you again. Therefore, listen to what I'm saying to you very carefully and take these words to those who could not be present here today."
Narrations mentioned that there were around 100,000 people witnessing the Khutbah al-Wada, this final sermon. So technically there were around 100,000 companions based on this. But of course, majority of them are not well known. We don't know them in detail. The ones we know of are the ones who are the most closely attributed to the Prophet.
For people, just regard this month, this day, this city as sacred, so regard the life of the Prophet Muslims. Return the goods entrusted to you to their rightfulness. Treat others justly, so that no one will be unjust to you. Remember that you will indeed meet your Lord. You will indeed reckon your needs. But Allah has forbidden you to take usury, riba. Therefore, usually, obligations shall henceforth be waived. Your capital, however, is you neither inflict nor suffer iniquity. Beware of the devil, safety of your religion. He has got full hope that you will ever be able to lead you astray in big things. So beware of conquering in small things. For people, it is true that you have certain rights for your woman, but they also have rights for you. Remember that you have taken them as your wife, only under Allah's and His permission. If they abide by your right, then to them belongs the right to be fed and clothing kindness. Treat your woman well and be kind to them. They are your partners and committed helpers. It is your right that they do not make friends with anyone to whom you do not approve, as well as never to be unchaste.
SubhanAllah, like the whole section of the final sermon of the Prophet dedicated to our women folk, and of course we know from the teachings of Islam, the Prophet said, the best of you are those who are best to their women folk.
O people, listen to me in earnest worship. Worship Allah, the one creator of the universe. Perform your 5 daily salawat. Fast during the month of Ramadan. Give your financial obligation, zakat of your wealth. Perform Hajj if you can afford to. All mankind are from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superior over a non-Arab, nor an Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over white except by piety and good action.
Except by righteous deeds. And this is, of course, something which, some countries continue to have issues and problems with. America, this country, other parts of the world, racism is a very serious problem. Whereas Islam seeks to eradicate all of those issues related to the color of one's skin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all of mankind from different colors, from different backgrounds, from different races. And the greatest of those people are the ones of taqwa, those who are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Learn that every Muslim is part of the Muslim. Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legislated to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it was given freely and willingly. Do not, therefore, do injustice to yourselves. Remember, one day you will appear before Allah. You will answer for your deeds. So beware, do not stray from the path of righteousness after I am gone. O people, no prophet or messenger will come after me, and no new faith will be born. Reason well, therefore, O people, honest and righteous to you. I am leaving you with the book of Allah, Quran, and Sunnah. Practices. If you follow them, you will never go astray. All of those who listen to me shall pass on my word to others and those to others again. And many of the last ones in this time of words listen to me directly. Be my witness, O Allah, that I have conveyed your message to the people.
This was one of the final times, or the final time, that the Prophet ﷺ had publicly spoken to the companions.
Illness and death of the Prophet ﷺ. It was during the last pilgrimage that Surah entitled Victory, Surah 110, revealed, which he received as an announcement of approaching death. Soon after his return to Medina, he fell ill. The tidings of his illness was dismayed by Arabia to the Prophet of Medina, Mecca, and towns. On the last day of his life, he came out from his room inside the Masjid of Medina and joined the public prayer, which Abu Bakr had been leading since his illness. And there was a great relief among the people who supposed him well again.
And that's the sign that Abu Bakr should have been the leader of this sin, because he was the one chosen to be the Imam of the Muslims for some. So that's one of the indicators.
When later in that day the rumor grew that he was dead, those who spread the rumor died of mission, declaring it a crime to think of the messenger of Allah, so I said to die. He was storming at the people in restraint. Came to the mosque and overheard him.
And of course, he understood that eventually the Prophet was going to die. Everyone knows that we are all going to die. But when a loved one passes away, when you hear the news of a loved one passes away, you don't think to yourself, oh, he's dead, okay, that finally happened. Waiting for that. No one thinks like this. When a loved one dies, there is a sense of shock. Even if he was sick, he was ill. There's a sense of shock, a sense of sadness. And so Umar is very emotional. He doesn't want to accept that, the one he loved the most, the most beloved person to all of us, has actually passed away. It's a very difficult thing for a person to deal with.
Abu Bakr went to the chamber of his daughter, Aisha. When the Prophet lay, having ascertained the fact, kissed the Prophet's forehead and went back into the mosque. The people were still listening to Umar, who was saying that the rumor was a wicked lie, that the Prophet was all in all to them, could not be dead. Abu Bakr went up to Umar and tried to stop him by a whispered word. Then, finding he would pay no heed, Abu Bakr who recognized his voice, then Umar came out of line.
And that's another sign of the Prophet, of the leadership of Abu Bakr out of the Prophet. That Umar was speaking, they were crowding around him. Abu Bakr started speaking, and they all left Umar and went to Abu Bakr. Maybe he knows this. Maybe he has that right. Meaning, he was of a senior position in Umar.
He first gave praise to Allah. Then he said, O people, lo, as for him who worshipped Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. For him who worships Allah, Allah is alive and dies not.
So that is the sign of Tawheed. So again, the message of Islam, the oneness of Allah, the importance of Tawheed, that even after the Prophet has passed away, Islam continues to live on because we don't worship the messenger of Allah, we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah Azza wa Jalla is al-Hayy. Al-Hayy la yamut. He is all living, ever living, he never dies. And so it's a beautiful reminder given by Abu Bakr, most wise words, the most appropriate words, the best things you could have said at that most appropriate.
He then recited the verse of the Quran. Muhammad is not my messenger. Other messengers have passed on before. So if he was to die or be killed, would you turn back on your heels to unbelief? And he who turns back on his heel will never harm Allah at all. Allah will reward the Quran. And say the narrator, eyewitness, it was as if the people had not known that such a verse had been revealed to other prophets.
Yeah, so they said when we heard this ayah being recited by Allah, it was as if we had heard it for the first time. This is the beauty of the Quran also, depending on your circumstances, on the context of what's happening in your life, you might read a specific ayah or a verse or a surah and you derive so many lessons and benefits from it that maybe you never thought of it.
And another witness tells when I heard of sacrifice, my feet were cut from beneath me, and I fell to the ground. Finally, without Allah's messenger was still. May Allah bless him. Final message was sent to the men who died at the age of 63 years old in the 10th year of Hijrah, in which is 60 years. Such is the Prophet's verse, and according to every saint of our human greatness can be measured. He was matchless, no messengers of praise.
We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that unites us all with beloved Messenger alayhi salatu wasalam, the highest station of Jannah, inshallah. And with that, we've concluded with the Seerah of the Prophet. As we can see, this is a lot to cover. So we've managed to cover the whole of Seerah in about 3 hours or so, which is pretty impressive thing to do. It's not hard, it's not an easy thing to do. Talking about the whole of the life of the Prophet. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah that He gave us the opportunity to be able to do this. And inshallah, hopefully, you guys benefited from hearing about the life of the Prophet. And maybe in the future, we could maybe do something in a bit more detail, which would be a good thing, inshallah, to do. Any questions before we conclude about the Seerah, about the life of the Prophet? Any questions?
So, you actually said that when these Yahudi women gave the Prophet the poison, and then he ate one of his Sahabi ate, then he forgave her. But was it the fact that she was killed because her poison killed the other Sahabi?
Yes. Yeah. So the Prophet forgave her, but she was punished as a result of the person that she had. Any other questions? Is there a question? How can you? Very good question. MashaAllah, how can you show love for the Prophet? The best way to show love for the Prophet is by following the Prophet. It's just like you follow your parents, you listen to your parents, you listen to the Prophet as well, and that's a sign of your love for the Prophet. Any other questions? جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته